one which is essential to the functioning of the ecosystem as a whole. Keystone species are the biological foundation that support the entire interdependent network of life. They are the ones that many other animals simply can't do without. Without them, the ecosystem would unravel. In British Columbia, the Pacific salmon are the keystone species. Each summer, millions of fish return to this coast to fill hundreds of streams and rivers, just as they have for thousands of years, feeding hundreds of species, including the local people, the First Nations, the ecosystems, and many of the local economies. Salmon have fundamentally shaped life on the coast. Yet quietly and without explanation, the numbers of salmon in BC are steadily dwindling. Many rivers are already on the edge of extinction. Here, in the world's largest sockeye salmon river, millions of fish are going missing. And many of the few that do make it back to the rivers are dying mysteriously before they have a chance to lay their eggs. Biologist Alex Morton has been following and studying the unusual decline.
Full of eggs, eh?
Yeah.
This is strange. You know, we're right on the spawning grounds. This fish has made the whole trip, but she never spawned. She never released those precious eggs. And we're seeing a lot of this. Most of these fish look like they haven't spawned. This pre-spawn mortality is epidemic in the Fraser River. So we're trying to figure out why.
The disappearing wild salmon is no small concern. Without them, BC will lose its most iconic species, as well as a culture, a way of life, and its most valuable natural food resource. The race is on to figure out what is happening to the iconic fish which built British Columbia, before it is too late. Not so long ago, the Fraser River was the mightiest sockeye salmon river in the world. Hundreds of millions of salmon returned to the tributaries that branched into a vast network of hundreds of rivers and streams, totaling thousands of kilometers in length, that infiltrated the entire southern half of British Columbia with salmon. The mysterious decline in the productivity of the Fraser River sockeye began in the 1990s. With each passing year, the productivity continued to fall. This was blamed on many things. Perhaps the waters were too warm. Maybe the fish were starving out at sea. Perhaps it was overfishing. The Department of Fisheries closed the commercial sockeye salmon fishery, but even that didn't seem to help. Even without the pressure of commercial fishing, the numbers of returning salmon continued to plummet. Something was very wrong. Alex Morton has been working as a biologist in the remote wilderness of the British Columbian coast for over 30 years, watching and studying the decline of BC's wild salmon.
This is the problem. This farm is just pouring out disease and pathogens, and our wild fish are swimming through it. I know, I've seen with my own eyes what happens to them when they go by.
When industrial fish farms moved into her neighborhood, it soon became apparent they were having impacts on the wild fish. The most obvious symptom was a dramatic rise in parasitic sea lice on the tiny juvenile wild salmon, who don't naturally carry the lice.
And sea lice aren't the only problem, but you know when these fish have lice on them from the farms, that they're also being exposed to whatever bacteria and viruses are on these farms at the same time.
The salmon farm or salmon feedlot is a whole different situation. It breaks the natural laws that make salmon move. So they hold 600,000 to over 1 million fish stationary in one place. This amplifies the waste, but also, most seriously, the pathogens. Because it's so easy for viruses and bacteria to jump fish, to mutate, and then explode out of the farm in a billowing cloud. This is the major wild salmon migration route in British Columbia. That's where they put the salmon farms. They're clustered in these little narrow channels. Now, when one of these farms has a disease outbreak, so many viruses come out of the farm that they actually fill the entire channel. And then here come the Fraser sockeye, and they go through this channel and they come out the other end. And when the fish go on, they're contaminated, without a doubt, with whatever is coming out of those farms. So if we just look at the timing of the situation, the Fraser sockeye began to decline in the early 1990s, at exactly the time that the salmon feedlots were put onto their migration route. The one run that is not declining is never found in those salmon farms and appears to be going around the southern end of Vancouver Island, and those are the Harrison sockeye, and they have been increasing over the same time period. Is it a coincidence that the only sockeye that are doing well are the ones that are not passing close to the salmon farms?
The Department of Fisheries and Oceans, otherwise known as DFO, is the agency responsible for the protection of fish in Canada. In 2006, DFO tasked one of their employees, Dr. Christy Miller, to look into the disappearance of the Fraser fish. Dr. Miller heads up a cutting-edge research lab, which uses an emerging science called genomic profiling, which gives scientists an unprecedented insight into the life history of a salmon.
Dr. Christy Miller, her work, genomic profiling, the way I see it is she makes the fish talk. It's like sitting a fish down in the office and saying, how are you feeling? So in all our bodies, we've got these switches that turn on and off in our cells depending on what kind of experience we're having with life. And she found that the ones that died before they spawned had all these switches flicked in their cells, and the ones that lived had a whole different pattern of switches. So she's like, okay, so the ones that are dying seem to be dying of the same thing. Well, that was huge, because all the other scientists that tried to figure this out were like, God, they're dying of everything, you know? They couldn't figure it out. And when she read these switches, they were like leukemia, retrovirus, brain tumor, immune system decay. And she looked at that and went, salmon leukemia. Salmon leukemia is this virus that raged through the salmon farming industry right at the beginning when it went into the Campbell River area in the early 90s. The salmon leukemia virus attacks their immune system, so they die of something else. It's a retrovirus like AIDS. And DFO wrote about 6 papers on it, and they found that virtually all of the Chinook farms were infected, and that this virus killed 100% of the sockeye salmon that were exposed to it, and they never did anything about it. And as soon as Dr. Miller's work, you know, her compass was all over the place. As soon as her compass pointed at salmon farms, she wasn't allowed to go to meetings. She wasn't allowed to talk to the media, even when she published in the journal Science.
The world's most prestigious scientific journal, Science, published Dr. Christy Miller's findings in January of 2011. It was hailed as some of the most significant new salmon research in a decade. Hundreds of reporters lined up to interview Miller about her findings, but they were all turned away.
Dr. Christy Miller is head of molecular science for DFO, one of the top scientists on the West Coast. And when we learned that she had a paper coming out in one of the leading journals, there was a lot of interest in the media in talking to her. I asked for an interview time to be set up, never heard back. So go back to DFO and ask what's going on, and there's met with this kind of wall of silence. There's no question that the federal government, with orders from Ottawa, muzzled her and kept her from speaking about a science paper which had been published. It's pretty disturbing, I think, when the government starts to mess around with science. It starts to try and shape the picture and try and control science in a way like that. I mean, muzzling scientists is not something that should be happening in a great democracy. There were questions about whether or not she'd get funding for continued research. Unfortunately, I guess I can't phone her up and ask her because she can't talk.
Dr. Miller, when she began to see a strong correlation between these dying sockeye and the salmon leukemia virus, and she read that the salmon leukemia virus was in the salmon farms, she naturally wanted to go test those fish. So in April of 2010, she made a request to DFO to test farm salmon for this virus, but access was denied. She was not allowed to test these fish that are in public waters, releasing their pathogens into the most valuable salmon stocks in this country, and she was not allowed to follow the trail into the pens.
To protect the interests of the salmon farming industry, the government allows the farms to keep their disease information confidential from the public and from scientists. There is no way to find out what diseases are on the farms.
The fact that the farms won't allow it is pretty suggestive to me. They're afraid of what will be found. If they were, not concerned as they claim to be, then they would surely open up their farms and say, come in and test because we're proud of our product and you won't find any issues. Clearly, they know that there are issues and they're not allowing testing for that reason.
In 2009, fishermen were getting ready for a good run to return to the Fraser River. An estimated 130 million young salmon had left the river in 2007 and were now due to return as adults. 13 million adult sockeye were predicted to return. All signs look good. However, instead of being a banner year, it turned out to be the worst in recorded history. Over 10 million fish vanished without a trace. It was an unexpected disaster. The fishing boats stayed tied to the docks, and thousands went without their traditional food supply. The government responded to the public outcry by announcing a federal inquiry into the decline. It was called the Cohen Commission.
Well, it was the first ever federal inquiry we've had on any fish species in Canada. We never had a commission on the collapse of cod, and that was a huge loss to Canada and to the world. And we should have learned a lot of lessons on that.
The $26 million inquiry included 150 days of hearings. Many theories were presented about why the fish might be disappearing. Items on the table included overfishing, sharks, water temperature, pollution, and even predatory giant squid. It wasn't until the final days that the inquiry turned its attention to salmon farms.